Okay, so we are on our last lecture for chapter 42. We are going to finish up the respiratory system in basically in humans, and we're going to look at the gas exchange between the within the capillaries within the lungs, and then we're going to talk a little bit about the effect of COVID-19 on the systems that we've been talking about, circulation and gas exchange. So the mammalian respiratory system, it's basically a system of branching ducts that bring air into the lungs. So if we want to do the first step, we have air inhaled through the nasal cavity right here. And within the nasal cavity, air is filtered through the little cilia and hairs that we have in our nostrils. It's also warmed, because now inside the body, our body temperature warms up the air, humidified, so some moisture gets added to it, and we sample it for odors, which has to do with food or taste or whatever. So the odor part is not at all important in terms of the respiratory system, but it's just what occurs in the nasal cavity. Okay, so after air enters through the nasal cavity, it's going to come back here to the pharynx. Remember that the pharynx was also important in the digestive system. The pharynx is that opening that joins the nasal cavity, the oral cavity, and also can join to the trachea and the esophagus. So the pharynx is back here. Okay, so it joins all of these different areas together. When we're talking about the respiratory system, we are going to avoid the esophagus because that's where food goes. That's not where air goes. So when we're dealing with the respiratory system, we have air coming in through the nasal cavity to the pharynx and then going into this little opening right here, which is the larynx, opening into the pharynx, or the pharynx going into the larynx. The larynx is also called the voice box. And it leads to the trachea, okay? And the trachea is where the air needs to go, and it's going to lead right to the lungs. Now remember that since this opening joins the pharynx joins the trachea and the larynx to the esophagus, there needs to be a way to make sure that food doesn't go down into your breathing tubes. So that's why you have this epiglottis here, and when you swallow, the epiglottis comes down and it covers up the larynx so that food is pushed into the esophagus and it does not go into the trachea. Okay, so once air passes through the pharynx and the larynx and into the trachea, now we're here, it will move down into the trachea, branches into these two different tubes called the bronchi. And bronchus is the singular of that, and bronchi is the plural. So the trachea branches into two large bronchi, and those bronchi then branch into smaller tubes called bronchioles, which eventually terminate in these structures called alveoli. Singular would be alveolus, but a group of them together is called alveoli, and those are at the terminus of every single one of these little bronchioles. And the alveolus is where gas exchange occurs. You can see that there are these capillary beds that are surrounding the alveoli. So that means this is where gas exchange occurs, where carbon dioxide coming from the blood goes into the alveoli, and then you'll be able to breathe that back out, because the air will go right back out through the bronchioles and the bronchus and the trachea, etc. Also, when you breathe the air in, this is oxygenated air. There's a lot of oxygen in the air, and the capillaries can pick up that oxygen and move that into the capillaries, and then they can here move the oxygenated blood back to the heart. That's going to be the pulmonary vein that brings oxygenated blood back to the heart. So to talk about that in a little bit more detail, again, the gas exchange takes place in the alveoli, which are at the very tip of the bronchioles. The oxygen diffuses through the epithelium of the alveoli into the capillaries, and carbon dioxide diffuses from the capillaries across this epithelium of the alveoli into the spaces. And then that carbon dioxide is going to be exhaled when you breathe out. One thing I didn't point out was this is the branch of the pulmonary artery that has oxygen-poor blood, and it's wrapping around the alveoli. So it's oxygen-poor blood. It's going to release its carbon dioxide in here. It's going to pick up oxygen, and now it's going to return to the heart through the pulmonary vein. And then once it gets to the heart, it's going to be pumped out to the systemic circuit. Okay, so now that we see how the gas exchange occurs, we're going to talk a little bit about breathing and how you ventilate your lungs. So breathing is the process of ventilating your lungs. It is the alternate inhalation and exhalation of air into your lungs and out of your lungs. The lung volume, the way we do this is lung volume increases as the rib muscles and the diaphragm contract. So when we breathe in, it's involuntary. We can do it voluntarily, but if we're not thinking about it, we still breathe. So when we breathe in, what we're doing is we're contracting our rib muscles and our diaphragm. When we contract our rib muscles, we actually move our ribs up and we push our diaphragm down. And what that does is it creates negative pressure, and air rushes in and fills the lungs with that negative pressure. When we relax, the diaphragm moves up and the rib cage moves down, and that compresses the lungs, and then air is forced out. Now, obviously, we don't get rid of all of the air in our lungs every time we breathe out. We still have air in our lungs that's sort of keeping them semi-inflated. So that's something to remember, and it means that our lungs are not nearly as efficient at removing oxygen as like gills would be for a fish. But we have ways of measuring this. So the tidal volume is the volume of air that we inhale with each breath. And after exhalation, a residual volume of air remains in the lungs. So you can measure these things to get an idea of how healthy your lungs are, actually. I should be really clear over here. Negative pressure is what happens when your diaphragm contracts, but when you relax or exhale, that's going to cause positive pressure, which is going to move the air back out. So this negative pressure refers to the inhalation, not the exhalation. Okay, so I'm trying to move the recording. There we go. So now we can talk about the pulmonary circuit and the coordination of circulation and gas exchange. So if we start here, we have inhaled air that's coming in through our lungs into the alveolus. The alveolus within the lungs is going to be the site at which deoxygenated blood becomes oxygenated in these alveolar capillaries. The oxygenated blood is going to come back to the heart. Remember, this is the left atrium. Oxygen-rich blood gets pumped into the left ventricle, and the left ventricle pumps the oxygenated blood to the rest of the body, out the aorta, and these are arteries, into the systemic capillaries all over the body. Additional gas exchange happens here. The oxygen leaves the capillaries, goes into the body tissue cells. Carbon dioxide leaves the body tissue cells, comes into the capillaries, and now you've got oxygen-poor and carbon dioxide heavy blood coming back to the heart, the right atrium, through the vena cava, the inferior vena cava here, or I guess either one. It would be either vena cava. So into the atrium, and then oxygen for blood gets pumped back out into the lungs, where in the pulmonary system. So this is the systemic circulation, and this is the pulmonary circulation, and now we've sort of incorporated the gas exchange happening in these capillary beds in the lungs and in the systemic circuit. I think I've actually talked about both of these. I did. I was on pulmonary circuit, and then I went to systemic circuit. So you've got all of that now. Here is a video explaining some of that. This goes into a little bit more detail than you need, but I think it's a pretty good video.
Whether you're racing in a triathlon or doing something less strenuous, you need to breathe in oxygen to help you get energy, and breathe out carbon dioxide, a waste product. When you inhale, your diaphragm and rib muscles contract, increasing the volume of your lungs. When you exhale, these muscles relax, decreasing the volume of the lungs. When the lungs expand, air pressure in the lungs drops, causing air to flow into the lungs. When lung volume decreases, air pressure increases, causing air to flow out of the lungs. Air enters the nose or mouth, moves down the trachea, and goes into the two bronchi. Air moves down smaller and smaller bronchioles until it reaches a tiny sac, an alveolus. Each alveolus is surrounded by capillaries. Oxygen diffuses from the alveolus to the blood, and carbon dioxide diffuses from the blood to the alveolus. As blood flows through the capillary, it becomes rich in oxygen. In the blood, oxygen diffuses into a red blood cell and binds to hemoglobin, a protein made up of 4 subunits. One oxygen molecule can bind to each subunit. Oxygen-rich blood flows from the lungs to the heart. Which pumps this blood to capillaries all over the body. Here, we see oxygen diffusing from a capillary's red blood cells into a muscle cell. Oxygen is used by the cell's mitochondria to produce ATP during cellular respiration. Carbon dioxide is released. How does carbon dioxide leave the body? Carbon dioxide diffuses from cells into capillaries. Some carbon dioxide stays in the plasma, the liquid part of the blood. Most carbon dioxide, however, enters red blood cells. Some carbon dioxide binds to hemoglobin. The rest is converted to bicarbonate, which diffuses into the plasma. This oxygen-poor blood flows back to the heart, which pumps it to the lungs. There, carbon dioxide diffuses from the plasma into the alveolus. Bicarbonate enters red blood cells and is converted back to carbon dioxide. Carbon dioxide is also released from hemoglobin. Carbon dioxide diffuses out of the red blood cells into the plasma and into the alveolus. When you exhale, air flows out of your lungs. And that's how you release carbon dioxide, get oxygen, and keep on running.
Okay, So that's pretty much the end of the chapter material, but I'm just going to talk briefly about how COVID-19 affects the respiratory system and the cardiovascular system. So COVID-19 is obviously the disease that's caused by the virus, which is causing the pandemic, which explains why we're doing online teaching and not seeing each other in class. So pretty much COVID-19 affects the respiratory system, and that's where the major effects are. So it's really a good time for us to learn about how that impacts the respiratory system. What it does is the virus comes into contact with the mucous membranes in the eyes, nose, or mouth, and when it finds a healthy cell, it enters the healthy cell and it replicates. But this virus can travel down airways and can infect the whole respiratory tract, and in some cases it even will reach the alveoli right here, which is where all of our gas exchange occurs. So while it's doing this, while it's infecting the cells, it's causing an immune reaction and inflammation within the respiratory tract where it's having the effect. So you guys learned about the immune system and about what it's like when there's inflammation. So it gets weepy, there's a lot of liquid that's released, and that can cause your lungs and your airways to become inflamed and swollen. And it can also cause a buildup of fluid. When you have a buildup of fluid in your lungs, that causes pneumonia. The alveoli, in serious cases, the alveoli can fill up with mucus, and then that completely limits or eliminates gas exchange. So when that happens, often patients get put on a ventilator to help them breathe because they can't breathe on their own. But once you get put on a ventilator, once the alveoli have been filled with fluid, then you really you may not make it at that point. And even if you do recover, you can have permanent damage to the lungs, and we don't really know how bad that will be. But this, I have a link here. We'll see how long or how effective it is, me clicking on it and getting you to see the video. Might take a second. Some cool things, you can see the trachea here, and you can see the alveoli and the bronchi. All the bronchioles. Okay. So that's how it affects the respiratory system. In terms of the cardiovascular system, it doesn't affect it quite as directly, or at least we don't know for sure why the cardiovascular system is affected by it. But we do know that those with cardiovascular disease have sort of the greatest risk of mortality of those individuals who contract COVID-19. Okay, so here you have cardiovascular disease. 10% of people with cardiovascular disease who were diagnosed with COVID-19 died. That's a pretty high percentage. So what we do know about the cardiovascular system in COVID-19 is that when you have COVID-19, your heart function does decrease, and there's two possible reasons for that. One, you can have a systemic inflammatory response. That means your entire body is having a really vast immune system response, and because of that, your heart becomes inflamed and stops working as well. Also, there are cases where the virus has directly infected the tissues of the heart and causing damage to the heart, which obviously reduces its effectiveness. And any existing damage that you have to the heart before you contract COVID-19 makes it much more difficult for you to recover from it. So now you know the effects of COVID-19 on the cardiovascular system and on the respiratory system. And this is the last slide for this entire chapter. I know it's a rough chapter, so I'm going to encourage you guys to start studying it soon.